Okay, we're covering the skeletal system. Um, this is sort of a tangential point, but it's well known. So children have many more bones than adults because they have large bones which are separated by cartilage into smaller bones. The most famous example is the skull. So this cartilage is going to slowly be ossified, right? Ossified means hardening into bone and will become one larger bone. There's some of that going on also in the arms and legs. Okay, it's kind of a tangential point. I don't know why I started with that. Um, Another little tangential point, more than half of our bones are in our hands and our feet. If you look at the wrist bones and the bones of the foot and the ankle, they're kind of odd looking, oddly shaped bones, and they're quite numerous. Right, each finger has 3 bones, and then with the metacarpals makes for a lot of bones. So more than half our bones in hands and feet. Okay, here's an important distinction. Tendons bind muscles to bone, right? So this muscle is bound by this tendon to this bone and bound by this tendon to this bone. Ligaments bind bones to bones. So they just give an overall structure to bones and give a limit to how far they can separate. So tendons, muscle to bone, ligaments, bone to bone. Here's an image of an important joint, right? The hip joint, and how the ligaments bind the bone to each other and give it a structure. Okay. Bones strengthen and grow more dense, and also a little bigger in size with use. So bones respond to use. We don't usually think of this. We're very well aware of this with muscle. Of course, muscle grows with use, but bones do too. Um, so a simple example is that if you imagine a tennis player, we wouldn't be surprised to find out they have stronger muscles in one arm, but they also have bigger, more dense bones in that arm. So apparently it's weight-bearing exercise that strengthens bone, in particular. So biking and swimming, where you're not bearing a lot of weight, would not develop bone density really. Astronauts, because of their situation with gravity, are especially vulnerable to bone atrophy. Okay, so here's what we're going to look at. The bones provide strength and structure. I think this one is pretty obvious. I'm not going to explain that. Bones provide protection. There's a couple of really famous examples. So of course the skull protects the brain, the rib cage protects the heart and lungs, and then we're going to learn of a third one very soon. And then these next two are not so intuitive, so I'll spell them out for you. Bones are involved with the production of blood cells, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells. And they're also involved with the storage of calcium in the hard bone matrix, in the mineral part of bone, and the storage of fat in a specific part of the bone marrow. Okay, we're not going to learn bone names right now. All right, this is an important structure because it's often misunderstood. So this is a vertebrae, right? One individual bone of your spine. When you feel the bumps on your spine, you're feeling this. This is dorsal, this is frontal, and they each have a big opening or hole like that. We'll talk about that in a minute. When you stack up these vertebrae, look what you get. You get the vertebral column. People usually call it the spine, but that's kind of vague. The bones are the vertebral column. Oh, I said count them to see how many are. So they have different names in the neck area and the chest area and so on. So you can count these up to see how many there are. These are fused vertebrae. So in animals, they articulate, they make joints, but in the human body, they're fused. Okay, so these are just 3 views of the vertebrae. It's kind of interesting to see the natural curvature. Okay, here's something important. So vertebrae are the individual bones of the vertebral column, right? This is one vertebrae, this is another one, and so on. The spinal cord is the bundle of nerves inside of the vertebral column. So if you go back to this image of the bone, there's this hole. They each have this hole. That it is through those holes that the spinal cord passes. So that's the bundle of nerves. It's hard to see in this picture, but this is the bundle of nerves. This is nerve tissue. It might look similar in color to the bone, but it's totally different. Soft nerve tissue. And that bundle of nerves is passing through all those holes in each vertebrae. And that way it's protected. It's totally enclosed and protected in the bone space of the vertebral column. Okay, note that in between each vertebrae, this light blue thing is a cartilage disc. It's actually called an intervertebral disc, and that's for cushioning. It has other purposes too. It helps the joint, the articulation, but it's for cushioning. If you can imagine jumping up and down, all your vertebrae would rattle together and it would be miserably painful, but instead they're nicely cushioned with cartilage. Each vertebrae is said to articulate. So articulate is the scientific name for making a joint, for a place where two bones meet and allow for motion. So vertebrae articulate with the vertebrae above them and below them, and also with the ribs. Well, this is a picture of how they articulate with the ribs, because it's kind of counterintuitive. These are the ribs. This is the vertebrae. It's obviously an articulation with very little motion, but it provides some motion so that we're flexible. Okay, so here we are again. This time the cartilage is gray. The nerve, I can't think of the word, the spinal cord, the bundle of nerves, is this yellowish thing, and they gave it a see-through look so we can see inside. But what's important here is to notice how there's big bundles of nerves that keep branching off. Right here you see it very well. Every time there's nerves branching off, let's pretend in the shoulder area there's bundles of nerves branching off. Where do they go? They travel down your arm to give nerves to all the muscles and all the tissue of your arm. And then lower down in your chest area, there will be nerves which travel to your heart and your lungs to innervate. Innervate means to feed nerve tissue, to feed nerves to all the different organs and body parts you have. And that's the way they are connected neurally, right? Without that, there would be no sensation, no movement. Okay, that's also why someone can become paralyzed, right? That if there's an injury to the spinal cord, the neural connection is lost, and paralysis is the result. Okay, here's some vocabulary. Osteo means bone. Articulation is a scientific name for joint. Okay, this is important. Cancellous bone, which we'll actually often call spongy bone, is a lighter weight bone full of tiny cavities. It's not actually spongy in texture, it's only spongy in appearance because it has lots of little holes, lots of little cavities. Compact bone is harder and denser. We'll get to these a little bit later. The periosteum, the outer lining of a bone, the endosteum, the inner lining. I think it's hard to picture it here, so we'll get to it later. So here is spongy bone, right? You can see all the many tiny holes, and spongy bone contains red bone marrow. So bone marrow, which is red, which is contained in these tiny little pockets of space in the spongy bone, and it is the place, red bone marrow produces red blood cells, white blood cells. Also something else that's important in your blood, platelets, which are involved with blood clotting, even though we haven't learned about them. Okay, found in the small cavities of spongy bone. Instead, there are also large cavities in the center of large bones, like your leg bones and your arm bones and so on, and they contain yellow bone marrow. And the main function of yellow bone marrow is to store fat. Okay, this is just to get a better look at everything. This is compact bone here. This is spongy bone. You can see its texture. Its appearance is spongy, I should say, but not its texture because it's not mushy. Compact bone is stronger and denser. It contains the yellow marrow. We'll see that again in a better in a picture further on. Spongy bone is found in the ends. Epiphysis means the ends, the top and the bottom of long bones. It's also found in the ribs and the shoulder blades. It's lighter and more flexible. So its purpose is that your skeleton not be any heavier than it needs to be. It makes us lightweight, or more lightweight. Okay, lots of important things here. So here is a typical long bone. At the ends, we find spongy bone. In the outer edges, we find compact bone. See all that outer edge? And in the center, we find compact bone that is hollow. It's hollow with a marrow cavity. Cavity means hole, a hole that will be filled with marrow. Remember that the red bone marrow will be found here in the little holes of the spongy bone. The yellow bone marrow will be a much bigger piece found in the center of the marrow cavity. Notice the light blue stuff is cartilage. It's called articular cartilage because articulation means a joint. So this cushions all the joints. So you can tell that this does not form a joint, but this part of the bone here will form a joint. Okay, cancellous bone is just another name for spongy bone. I think we've talked about everything except for this. and this as well. Their scientific name is the epiphyseal plate. We call them growth plates, and we'll talk about what they are. They're always at the ends of long bones. Okay, make sure you can answer all these questions. The cartilage is found in the growth plate and in the articular cartilage. I think the spongy bone exists to make us lighter weight. And remember that compact bone is found on the outer edges and in this central hollow part. It's the outer part. Okay, I think this is a great photograph. You can see the compact bone outer edge, the spongy bone interior, and you can see its spongy looking appearance. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Okay, here's what a growth plate is, right? So this thin area of cartilage present at the very ends of the bone, of any long bone. And what will happen is one side keeps adding cartilage on during a time of growth. And the other side, the side that's closer to the center of the bone, hardens the cartilage. The cartilage is ossified, it becomes bone. And so that's the cartilage is the tissue that grows to lengthen, and the cartilage becomes ossified. And this continues for as long as growth continues until eventually it gets totally ossified in an adult that has finished growth. Okay, so endosteum is just this inner lining on the inner hollow part of the bone. Periosteum is the outer one. Growth plates enable growth in length. Periosteum and endosteum are important for growth in width of a bone and also for repair when there's injury. This is a good view of articular cartilage. You can get a sense of what it really looks like. Some people think this is gross, but when you actually eat chicken, you eat a whole chicken, sometimes you get a very good view of these little articular cartilage pieces of the chicken bones. Okay. So I don't know why I have this here. This is misplaced. You already know this. Red bone marrow inside the tiny little holes, yellow bone marrow inside the big marrow cavity. And oh, this is kind of a cool look at spongy bone. Its irregular shape gives it a place for, gives a location for red bone marrow. It also gives a place for blood vessels and nerves to travel. Osteoporosis is a condition of having, osteoporosis literally means porous bone, and it means the bones are excessively porous. They're holey, they have way too many holes, and this makes them fragile and brittle. And it becomes a really significant difference. It happens to people who, it happens to the elderly somewhat naturally. It's debated how much calcium absorption is related to this. Lack of calcium in your diet can contribute to this, and so on. Okay, important tissue. Important question. Is bone tissue alive or dead? It would seem to be dead in a way because we think of bones as hard minerals. And in fact, they sort of are, right? They contain calcium. They actually contain calcium phosphate. And especially the C is missing, but especially when you consider how slowly bones decompose and remain intact almost for years. So I obviously wrote this slide too quickly. But if you think of skeleton, much of tissue decomposes quickly and the skeleton remains for a long, long time as though it's not living tissue. On the other hand, if bone is not alive, why do broken bones hurt? How do they heal? How do they grow, etc.? So clearly it's kind of a tricky question. And here's the simple answer. The bone matrix is made of collagen, which has flexibility. It's a tough tissue with flexibility. And the hard mineral part is calcium phosphate. Matrix means a surrounding medium or a surrounding structure. Osteocytes, which is the name for bone, osteo means bone, cyte means cell. Individual bone cells are embedded within that mineral matrix. Okay, so I don't know how helpful these pictures are, but each little purple thing is a bone cell, and the rest of the tissue is surrounding bone matrix. And all these little blue lines and canals are places where blood vessels and nerves can travel to nourish the bone cells. Here's another image. Here, the yellow is the bone matrix. That's the hard calcium phosphate. And yet there's these holes in it where bone cells live, and they have all these little canals for the blood vessels they need to nourish them and the nerves they need to give them sensation. So these are real photographs. Isn't that crazy? It